People sometimes ask me how I ended up in KM, and I have to say it was all a bit random. I was actually on maternity leave, having had my son, and I was fully intending to go back to fee earning when my maternity leave came to an end. But while I was away, the lady who used to do the KM work in my law firm decided she had just had enough of working. Her husband was away all the time, she'd had enough, and she was going to leave. So my boss got in touch with me and said, I know I'm not actually supposed to get in touch with you when you're on maternity leave, but there's this great job coming up and I think you'd really enjoy it. So I thought, why not? Gave it a go, and actually absolutely found my niche by accident. Found that I completely loved it. I did a week-long foundation course by a lady called Juliet Humphreys, who used to be head of knowledge for Bird and Bird, who are a big law firm in London. And it's like everything slotted into place for me. And I really thought, why did I not know all this stuff while I was in practice? So that's kind of how I got into KM and what I do now.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think, most people find that their journey into knowledge management, knowledge translation, whatever knowledge field you're in, isn't exactly a linear sort of occurrence. People seem to just fall into it from different backgrounds. And so, I guess the first burning question is, what are law firm knowledge managers like? Typically speaking, what's their background? How do they fall into it? Were they like you, that they found their niche, or is it something that they typically have 1 or 2 degrees?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think law firms are a bit different to a lot of other businesses that have KMers in them. Law firm knowledge managers tend to come up from one of either 2 strands. So they either come up, as I did, through being a practicing lawyer. So you become a practicing lawyer, you practiced for maybe 8+ years, so you're very much seen as a subject matter expert, and then you make the move into knowledge management then. Or the other strand, a lot of people come in through the information professional side. So a lot of people will have been running library services and databases on the information side, and then their firm asks them to take on responsibility for knowledge management as well. And I meet a lot of those people on the courses that I teach who say, I've been asked to do this knowledge management stuff, but I don't really understand how it's different to information management and how I need to tailor my approaches for the knowledge side of things for the lawyers that I'm looking after. So it's kind of 2 strands to it. Yeah, I think it is a bit of a female area of the law. There's an awful lot of women who are lawyers who go into it because it's one of the very few roles that you can do as a subject matter expert. Keep your practicing certificate going, stay on the roll as a lawyer, but not have to be there 5 days a week, 8 till 6 is the minimum, doing horrendous hours, being, in my case, required to go off to court all the time. The court doesn't really care if my child is sick. So there ends up being quite a preponderance of women on the subject matter expert side of things.
And so what do you see? I mean, you mentioned briefly that a lot of people in the courses that you take are sort of information curation specialists, information management. How do you differentiate that from what you currently do? Or is that part of what you do?
It's kind of part. I think the thing that information managers need to probably add into their practice is probably what I'm going to talk about a bit later, the idea that that there's a lot of tacit knowledge that a lot of lawyers hold that's quite difficult to extract from them. So databases cannot be your default situation for a lot of the knowledge that lawyers hold. trusting networks that you have to build between people so that they'll talk to each other about their deep and tricky issues is quite a big part of the knowledge management side, as opposed to the information management side.
Okay. And so what, you said you found your niche within knowledge management. What was it about the field of knowledge management and that really drew you towards it? Like, why is it your niche? Why is it your passion?
I think it's to do with the fact that it draws on so many different disciplines. You know, one minute you're talking about learning networks, and you're trying to understand how, for me, lawyers can learn very tricky legal issues, how they can learn to balance multiple inputs and come to some advice for people. And then the next minute you're thinking about what makes a great database. You know, do you have to have video clips in it? You know, how are you going to get that going? Then you're thinking about motivation. You're thinking about trusting networks. You're thinking about, how do I connect people? How do I get people over their fear of sharing their knowledge with each other? So I think it's just so, I just find it very, very interesting. And I guess also in the legal sector, I feel it's very much the foundation of everything that lawyers do. You know, if you think about it, lawyers sell solutions to their clients that's based on their collective knowledge. So anything that you do around knowledge management can really help make the business more efficient, make the job more interesting, because a lot of lawyers are really nerdy about their law and they really love doing the complex things. They don't want to be doing the paper shuffling type things. They want to have all the process streamlined so that they can focus where they really add value.
And sorry, you might get in this a little later with a couple of my other questions, but you mentioned that sort of getting people to share information and knowledge is obviously part of your work. Do you think that's particularly more difficult in the law sector? Like, are lawyers and people that you work with more protective of their knowledge? Like, is it proprietary to them? And is getting to share that knowledge sort of difficult, or are they open once they know there's an avenue for sharing?
A lot of it is going to depend on the culture within the law firm. I've worked at firms where nobody really talks to each other and everyone is very closed off and holds on to their knowledge because that's their power. And I've also worked at other very collaborative type firms where people do share matters and work on matters together in sort of a team approach. But I think one of the things that people don't always realise about lawyers and sharing their knowledge is people see lawyers and they see them being very confident. They see them representing people. They would see me standing up in court, making my submissions, looking like I really know what I'm doing and I'm very confident in it. But a lot of lawyers don't feel confident when they're amongst their peers about sharing their expertise. They worry a lot about being judged. They worry they're mixing with very intelligent people, all experts in their own field. The idea of sort of putting your hand up and saying, yep, I know how to fix that for you. You're seeking that knowledge, and I can help you with that. People are very reluctant to do that because they're worried that they're wrong, that someone will, strike them down. It's quite an interesting thing to see.
And so, you mentioned that some law firms are a lot more open and some are more closed off. Are there any major differences you see? Is it knowledge sharing culture? And is that what needs to change in the law firms that are closed off? Or is it just they don't have the mechanisms there to share it, and so they don't?
Well, I was going to talk about this later, but we'll talk about it now. No, that's fine. I did some research as part of my MBA into knowledge sharing behaviours, because I was very interested to understand what law firms had to have in place to enable their lawyers to share their knowledge with each other. So it was all about kind of what ducks people have to have in a line before the lawyers will get on and share. And one of the things I looked at there was to do with intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I looked at trust levels within the business. I looked at things like targets, because that's a big thing within the legal sector at the moment. There's lots of law firms thinking the way we're going to get over the reluctance to share knowledge is we're going to give everybody a target to do it. And one of the other things I looked at was how chargeable time and billing targets affected knowledge activity. So I don't know if people know much about this, but the way that a lawyer generally is measured by the business that it's in, so measured as in, you know, what bonuses will they get, what pay rises will they get promoted, is a lot of the time down to how many chargeable hours they log each day and how many of those are converted into billings. So it's a very old-fashioned and quite crude way to measure people, but that's really prevalent, and some of these targets are absolutely monstrous. I mean, mine was a fairly middle-of-the-road target of 7.5 hours chargeable time a day. So when you think you're probably working 8 hours officially a day, or 7.5 hours of those had to be chargeable.
Wow.
So any other work that I did, whether that was to do with knowledge sharing, whether that was to do with teaching, whether that was to do with marketing work to bring more business into the business, that would all be non-chargeable. So all things like that have to be either crammed into what's left in your half hour left over at the end of the day, or what most people do is expand their days to try and cram it.
So to me, that really reminds me a lot, and Vicky said as well, of academics, in the sense that, you know, there's really a disincentive to share, because, you know, academics, lawyers, they have so much to do, their day is so busy, and they don't really get the extra credit, as it were, for any of these knowledge management or knowledge translation activities. Is that starting to change in your field, or is that still the case that, you know, that's just something extra that you're expected to do on top of your regular duties?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's starting to change as law firms are starting to understand the business benefit of doing all this knowledge sharing and the knowledge work. But it's still very much something that people are expected to do on top of their chargeable hours. I haven't come across any law firm that's prepared to reduce the chargeable hour target in order to facilitate all the extra knowledge work that they're expecting people to do, but they are starting to take it a bit more seriously. I mean, when I did my research, there was, I sort of had a lot of it was by survey, but I had a few empty text boxes for people just to put whatever they wanted to tell me in. And there was such a heartfelt comment from one lawyer that they wrote. They were saying how if they don't do their chargeable time and then get their billings done, then they won't have a job. If they don't do their money laundering checks, then they could go to jail. If they don't do their training work, they won't get their CPD and they won't be allowed to be a lawyer anymore. If they don't do the marketing, then they won't have a client next week. And they were like, and I really want to do my knowledge sharing, but really, once I've done all those things, there's very little time left.
Yeah.
And it gives you an idea of the hierarchy of the non-chargeable things that people are expected to do. I think people are trying to bump knowledge sharing up a bit on that hierarchy, but there's still a lot of things people are expecting their lawyers to do within their business that they're not being, you know, judged for, sort of thing.
So really, to convince the law firms to sort of get into this, you need to speak their language. You need to tell them how they will save money in the future, how it will be more, the whole system will run more efficiently. Have you come across any big law firms that actually employ like a knowledge management specialist within it? Like that's their job within the law firm, or is it more consulting, you coming in, helping them do it themselves, you know, as opposed to a third party?
Yeah, I mean, it really kind of depends on the size of your law firm, because knowledge people are very much seen as an overhead. So if you are a very big Magic Circle law firm based in London but with offices globally, then they tend to have a lot more people in pure knowledge roles. And those knowledge people tend to have like a clearer career progression available to them. But law firms that are a bit smaller, maybe who are regional heavyweights, so still pretty big law firms, they might have one knowledge lawyer, say, in a department. So that would be someone like me, maybe, who used to be a practicing lawyer, who would maybe be there 2 or 3 days a week, looking after knowledge needs and trying to be that interface between the lawyers doing all their billing and the needs of the business, and trying to encourage the knowledge sharing that way. And bigger firms are starting now to get more interested in getting graduates and other experts in to the business. So I see people now with job titles like innovation manager and things like that. So that's starting to happen, but really there was kind of the knowledge lawyer or professional support lawyer, they're sometimes called, tends to be the person who's embedded in a department and helping them with their knowledge sharing. And they don't have a chargeable time target. So that's why they're often seen as an overhead and often the first to go when times get hard.
Fair enough. I have a couple of comments just from Susan and Lincoln. They really like the idea of that sort of hierarchy of tasks and where do the knowledge management activities fit within the hierarchy of the half hour, that is. And Luke is interested in knowing, like, as you go in as a consultant, how do you get them to think about bumping that up? Bumping up in the hierarchy, the sort of K-star tasks,
Yeah, I mean, really, when I'm talking to law firms about benefits of knowledge management, I'm talking about efficiency, effectiveness, and profitability, because those are the things that they really care about. So, we talk a lot about all the different ways that improved knowledge sharing can help their business. So, improved client knowledge. People are often, when they think about knowledge management in the legal sector, they're thinking know-how. They're thinking what lawyers know and how we can improve how they use what they know. But actually, client knowledge is a big part of that. I've heard terrible tales of one partner going to visit a client, not using their CRM. Someone else goes along the very next day to see the same person, but they're a different department. They've no idea that they've talked to each other. Whereas, if they knew a bit more about each other and what they were doing and about the client and what they're interested in, they could have been more efficient and maybe looked a bit more professional about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and process is a big thing at the moment in law firms. That's quite new to the legal sector, looking at how lawyers do their lawyering rather than just giving them access to precedents and databases or, trying to connect them for conversations. So, looking at maybe if you have some litigation, because obviously that's what I used to do, that's what I know about. So you think about the process from when the claim first comes in to how you investigate it, to how you defend it through the court system, and see if there are any ways to improve that process. So everyone's quite interested in that side of things now as well.
Okay, so let me get back to the questions that I had scripted here. You mentioned conversations, and so conversations as a process. So, I mean, given the topic of this of the webinar about having a conversation, you and I, but also the importance of conversations within the legal sector. What importance do you give sort of conversation, and what interests you about that topic?
Well, for me, I think conversations and trusting networks are a really massive, or ought to be a really massive part of any law firm's knowledge management strategy. I think that there are a few basics that law firms have to have in place. They have to have a decent precedents, a way for their lawyers to access their precedents. So, your lawyer is preparing your lease or something, he doesn't draft that from scratch every time. He has a precedent that gives him the bulk of what needs to go into it, and he has a few draft clauses that he might want to include, might not want to include, depending upon the transaction. The precedents are really important, keeping them up to date. That sort of explicit knowledge that works very well in a database, that's really fundamental to law firms. Things like supervision and mentoring is really fundamental to law firms. But there tends to be a lot of that because they're all quite risk averse. So there tends to be a lot of audits, there tends to be a lot of supervision. So they've got that mentoring or, senior junior supervision going on. But kind of once you get past the explicit knowledge and the straightforward knowledge, I think the difficult thing for law firms is to get their people talking to each other about the deep and complex knowledge. So in my old field, you would often have a situation where you would be looking at a claim and you would have conflicting medical evidence. So you would have expert evidence on both sides, both, equally expert, well-respected experts, but they would be saying different things about whether there was a breach of duty or whether that breach of duty caused that loss. So as a lawyer, you look at that and you're thinking, how do I weigh that up? Or you might be looking at something like a procedural issue where the court rules say that whole claim could be struck out because they've not done something that they were supposed to do according to the procedure. But there's some discretion maybe for the judge if they think it's too draconian to strike a claim out. So you're in these situations where you've got all these multiple inputs and you're trying to work out what the best thing to do is. You're trying to work out how to advise your client to move forward. And I tend to think that's the kind of really tricky situation where if you can have trusting networks within the law firm where people are comfortable having conversations with each other, I think the conversation really works well and efficiently to help transfer the knowledge between, the person who, the knowledge seeker and the knowledge giver. And I think conversation is particularly efficient at that because there's so many other things going on. We kind of think that it's all about our words and what we've said, but actually there's so much more that people pick up when they're in a conversation. There's a lot about body language, there's a lot about intonation, and also, to and fro between two experts, can really help them get to the bottom of what the exact issue is. Lawyers will use a lot of jargon between themselves because it's a shortcut language, isn't it? Yeah. They wouldn't use that in front of the client because the client might not understand it, but amongst themselves, in the conversation, they can use the jargon to really get to the real issue of what's going on. And I think also conversation, rather than seeking knowledge in a more sort of one-way thing from a database, enables people to ask questions of each other. And you might find that the knowledge seeker is actually asking the wrong question, that there might be something else going on that they haven't realised. And during the course of the conversation, then that often sort of comes out in a way. So I kind of think it's for that really complex stuff that's really hard to pin down. I think conversation really hits all the spots.
Yeah. And the idea of a trusting network as well. I mean, I get from what you're saying that, that's a very important feature of having these conversations, but, how do you get there? How do you get to a trusting network? And, are there any, this is sort of related to a question that was asked in the chat box, but are there any metrics that you use to sort of quantify, if the trusting network is actually being effective in reducing bottom line, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, just if you could talk a little bit more about the trusting networks. I think that's a really interesting idea. And to me, it kind of sounds like organizational culture sort of concepts, but if you could just, explain that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the, because my thing that I really care about quite passionately is finding really cheap, simple, easy ways of getting this into law firms. Law firms never want to spend much money. That's kind of the way they are. But I think there's lots of really simple ways that most firms can get more conversation into their daily work, and also that they can help build those trusting networks. So some of the things I often talk to law firms about is getting their internal experts database right. So some people call it white pages, whatever. Getting that right, I think, is really useful, and it's not hugely difficult. So some of the ways that I encourage them to think about that experts database is not to ask the lawyers to input their information themselves, because I worked in a law firm where they tried to get us to do that, and the truth was most people put their name and their extension number and nothing else because they were too busy doing chargeable work to spend any time doing it. You also then, if you were asking people to do it themselves, even if they spend the time on it, you'll often end up with people who are confident and outgoing and want to get involved, having lots of expertise written down, but people who are perhaps very thoughtful but still very expert or a bit introverted, not volunteering to be an expert in things. So you don't necessarily get the right experts. One of the things I tell law firms to do is to stop asking lawyers to do it themselves and make being an expert a real privilege. Make it something to aspire to. See if you can keep accreditation as an expert as something that the knowledge managers do, and people apply to be considered an expert and maybe demonstrate what they know, what they've written about in peer review articles and that, what training they've given, what other people think of them, that sort of thing. So I think that can be really useful. I also think as regards white pages, if you can also include two kinds of experts. So you can include the expert that maybe whose name you would give to a client. So maybe someone quite senior. If you're the last person still working in the office at 9 at night and a client phones and you're the only one there, make it easy to look up so that you can give them that expert's name and how to get in touch with them. But also include someone more junior who's still an expert and knows plenty about it, but is the kind of person that junior people don't mind talking to. Because of the way the hierarchies work in law firms, a lot of junior lawyers are going to be very reluctant to disturb a partner or someone who's, quite senior in their business. So I think it's really useful to have a sort of senior junior expert so that people have got someone, that they can talk to, that they can take a problem file to and say, this is on the cusp of going wrong, I don't know what I'm doing, help me, sort of thing, and know that they will be treated kindly by someone who's not so senior, they're going to get them sacked and that kind of thing. So I think getting your experts database right is really good, so people know how to get in touch with each other. But then after that, I think there's lots of really small projects that people can do. There's things like the RCT with the random coffee connections, which I think your network's done.
Yeah. Worked for us twice.
Yeah, I think they're fantastic. I really do. I think that's such a great idea. Connect people at random, mix people up, so that they really do get to understand, what commercial litigation is doing compared to what, conveyancing is doing. It gives you a great idea. And it's great for cross-selling. You mentioned cross-selling and the lawyers love that idea. So that's another very easy project that you can do. And another one is what we often called an Ask an Expert coffee morning. So what you do is you have a room in your law firm and you get all those sort of senior, junior, knowledgeable but friendly types in. And then they just mingle and drink coffee, and then people can bring their problem files and talk about, their tricky issues with these sort of friendly but knowledgeable lawyers in the room. And because, the atmosphere is a bit more mellow, people find that quite a good way to share their knowledge and tease out tricky issues with each other. And also, as I like to tell lawyers, that could be chargeable work. Because one of the decisions about whether something's chargeable or not chargeable often is have you moved the matter on? Does your involvement in a file mean that matter can now take a step forward? So if you've unblocked someone from a knowledge issue through your conversation, you can often then charge the client for that conversation because it's useful for the matter involved. So yay, knowledge sharing and chargeable as well.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that idea of the ask an expert, and maybe we can do something like that even in the KIPL. Like if students want to come and ask sort of the experts questions, then that might help them. And it's interesting that you mentioned that the hierarchy of these sort of law firms means that a junior person's not really able to talk to or is worried about sharing their knowledge in that sense. So that's a barrier to knowledge sharing. But then you also mentioned that maybe by making experts sort of a status symbol, a hierarchical symbol, that those people might be more willing to share their knowledge. So it seems like that the hierarchy can work both in favor and against knowledge sharing. Knowledge sharing, across seems to be, hindered by the hierarchical nature, but knowledge sharing, top down might be much better in that sort of system. Have you experienced any sort of what's your sense of how the hierarchy affects knowledge transmission through the system?
Yeah, I mean, when I did my research into knowledge sharing behaviours, one of the things I discovered was that lawyers as a group tended to be quite strongly intrinsically motivated to share their knowledge. And the things that people talk to me about their difficulties were to do with the barriers that the nature of the business puts in their way. So people sort of, when they replied to my research, were talking a lot about how much they enjoy teaching, how much they enjoy helping, how much they enjoy sharing their expertise. But the chargeable hours thing, the fact that nobody seems to value it, stops them doing it as much as they would like. So, I tend to tell law firms to really tap into that as much as they can anyway. That a lot of lawyers are going to really enjoy that if you give them the space and time to do it. Some of them are natural teachers and some of them are natural mentors. And some of them maybe aren't so good with people. There's a lot of introverts in the legal sector, people who like to get their heads down and work at a desk on their own. But they're often very good with knowledge artifacts, checking precedents for, latest legal updates, new regulations, making sure they're up to date. So I kind of think if you can kind of get around a lot of these things if you play to people's strengths. I suppose that's common to all knowledge work, isn't it? But there tends to be a bit of a thing in the legal sector at the moment to talk about extrinsic motivators, like making it part of someone's appraisal that they have to have done so many bits of knowledge management work on top of their fee earning work. A lot of people were thinking that's the answer to our knowledge sharing cultural issue, that we're just going to make it important in the same way as chargeable hours are important. But actually, people have found the usual problems when you put a very simple metric like that around knowledge sharing, that, they get an awful lot of dross in the month before the appraisal time, or that they get inundated, or it's not the right thing, or, people are doing it because the target says they should, rather than because it's the right thing for their knowledge sharing behaviour.
And that, that really rings true too with academia as well. I mean, we're trying to get these academics to cross boundaries, talk out of their silos. And one of the methods for doing so is, to start incentivizing externally with these teaching dossiers, because, maybe if we give that, maybe if it counts towards promotion or tenure, then people will be more likely to do it. But it's, from what you're saying, that seems to suggest that maybe that's not the best way to go about it, because then people will do it for the wrong reasons. And it doesn't foster that cultural shift within the organization that we so desire, by making it a sort of required piece, as it were. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, in the research that I did, I looked at some lawyers who had these extrinsic motivators, targets and whatever, and compared their knowledge sharing behaviours to those without. And they did seem to share a little bit more than those without, but they were mainly sharing within their close teams. Now, I know there's been some research before on it that suggests that there does tend to be more knowledge sharing as a result of extrinsic motivators, but the people who are giving the knowledge tend to be strategic about what they do because they realise it's all part of a target and they want to make the most of it, you know, get the best benefit from their knowledge sharing activity. So I wondered if there was something like that going on in law firms as well. But the other thing I did as part of my research is I had a very small number, too small really to draw any broad conclusions, but a small number of massively high sharers who were doing vast amounts of knowledge sharing. And when I looked at their behaviours, actually the thing that absolutely made them different to the run-of-the-mill knowledge sharing lawyer was their level of understanding of how knowledge management benefits the business. They seem to have a much higher understanding about how it feeds into profitability and sustainability of a profitable law firm compared to your average lawyer. So I thought that's probably quite an important thing, and also quite an easy thing maybe for law firms to take on board, that you know, people don't necessarily need a very big understanding of what knowledge management is and all the ins and outs and everything. But if they had a better understanding about how their knowledge activities mean that their law firm will still be there in 10 years' time and will still be paying them a decent salary and, you know, will still be efficient and effective and profitable, then maybe they would, you know, move knowledge management up a bit on that hierarchy of things to do.
Yeah. So it seems that the problem is, you know, when we talk about the barriers to knowledge translation or knowledge management or whatever, it seems to be, you know, they don't know, don't understand, don't care, don't believe. And so in this case, it seems to be they just don't care. And so maybe if we make them care a little bit more, that, you know, that sharing this knowledge is a valuable thing and here's how it benefits not only you, but the entire organization, that we might get a little bit more pull from those individuals.
Yeah, I mean, when I asked the lawyers what they would like in place to encourage knowledge sharing, they all said they wanted extrinsic motivators, despite being intrinsically motivated and having answered all my questions saying, you know, I love doing this and whatever. They all said they wanted targets. Now, from the sort of more free flow text that I got through, I think that was mainly about moving knowledge sharing up that hierarchy. It was about the leadership demonstrating the importance of the importance that they felt, you know, knowledge sharing activities ought to have within the business. So I think kind of, even though they all asked for targets, I think what they were asking actually was, leadership, please take this seriously in the same ways you take the billing that we do seriously.
Yeah, sometimes you have to see through what people say they want.
Yeah.
People are complex humans, you know, Vicky's just talking about in the chat box, but I think it was Henry Ford once said, if I asked the public what they would have wanted, they would have said faster horses. You know, they often, they don't realize what it is they're actually wanting out of the situation. I think you read through it really great there that, you know, they don't want extrinsic motivators, but they want people to take it as seriously as they do the billing hours. And that's a great insight. I really like that. You know, I'm just trying to think here with, there's only 15 minutes left. I have a couple of end questions for you, but I want to just open it up to the floor. Does anybody have any specific questions that they'd like to ask? And if so, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. And don't be scared. It's okay.
I'm the scared one.
Or ask it in the chat box. You don't have to talk. I'm just trying to be conversational. Oh, David. Yes. You're on, David. Wait. I can't unmute you.
I can unmute me.
Okay.
Are we good?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you very much. My question is actually for Vicky, who I hope will be able to answer. I asked this in the chat box because she's done a lot of work on knowledge sharing, but not in the legal space. So I'm wondering, Vicky, from your work on knowledge sharing, what if this is resonating with you and in the health and social care spaces where you've studied knowledge sharing?
That's really mean, David, because this is supposed to be Helene's webinar, not mine.
I'll just drink my tea.
But actually, so much of what Helene's been talking about resonates with me in lots of different contexts. One, in academia, actually. So the idea that lawyers have to charge for their time, and that you can't justify spending time on knowledge sharing, or all of that, is exactly the same in academia. So there is intense pressure for us as academics to basically be covering our salaries. So the pressure from my boss is to write, to put grants in, to bring money in. That is what I am paid to do. That is what I am told I am paid to do. So in many ways, it's very similar to being in a law firm. So there's a lot of that going on, and there's also a lot of fear that people have about sharing what they know and sharing their knowledge. And I know that everyone thinks that, you know, we have a lot of very loud academics who are quite happy to share what they know all the time, but actually a lot of people, particularly when you put in a room of other academics, you think, well, no, actually I don't think I entirely know what I'm talking about, and someone else is bound to know more than I do, so I'm not going to open my mouth and say anything. And Suzanne was making an insight as well that this is very similar with librarians. So I think it's part of the human condition in many ways, that we're just kind of hardwired to not want to share knowledge and be a bit reticent about that, and to want to reach out and be social creatures at the same time. And it's just a huge dichotomy, I think. But with the health and social care professionals that I worked with, again, there's this fear of uncertainty as well. There's this fear of admitting that you don't know things, and sharing kind of means that sometimes you have to admit that you don't know things because you're asking for knowledge from other people at the same time. And people want to come across that they know what they're doing a competent job because of those, otherwise they might lose their medical license or whatever. So it's really, really similar. So I know, Helen, that you think that like law firms are really special and unique, but actually they're just the same as everyone else.
Yeah.
That's great, thanks. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments about that? Just raise your hand. Oh, here we have one. I'm going to, oh, you've unmuted yourself, go for it.
I've already unmuted myself. A very interesting presentation, and I've really been enjoying it. One of the questions that I have is around the penetration of technology into this. I know that depending upon the size of the firm, well, what brings it is the fact that, you know, we don't need law clerks anymore to search through all those volumes of precedents for us to find those things. They're now all available on databases, and so you need search strategies and the skills to use those. Do you see that moving forward as well, a database, that sort of intrinsic information that's harder for people to share, that then monetizes an entirely different way of producing that knowledge, where an expert sort of pulls that together, maybe hires on 150, 200 lawyers to contribute towards that, but then makes that a sort of monetized knowledge mobilization service for lawyers.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point in the legal sector at the moment, because well, you can imagine it's interesting everywhere with what's happening with AI. I don't know if people have followed, but there had been a competition recently between something called Case Cruncher, which is an AI program designed to look at lots and lots of cases to do with mis-selling. And they basically opened it up to lawyers as well, saying, we're going to have this competition, we're going to run through all these cases using Case Cruncher, and they're going to is going to guess what the outcome ought to be in all these different cases. And the lawyers, you're welcome to have a try, as many as you want. And they were comparing the results, and in fact, AI Case Cruncher beat the lawyers. It was more accurate. Well, so it's going to be a very interesting time, I think, for the legal sector, when, you know, technology really starts to penetrate, when we have databases large enough so that you know, there can be the right kind of learning around, you know, what makes a case, you know, successful or unsuccessful. I tend to think it's going to be a tool for use by perhaps more expert lawyers. So maybe there's going to be difficulty with the current swathe of lawyers kind of below the real true experts. And also I think the legal sector have to think about how they're going to train people up now, because, you know, if AI or Case Crunch is going to do all the simple work, and we don't need all those, you know, in the same way that we don't need all those clerks searching through stuff anymore because everything's in our databases. You know, again, there's going to be another wave of people on the sort of lower end who aren't going to be needed in the future. But then how do you become an expert lawyer if you don't have that opportunity to work through, you know, and get exposure to lots and lots of different cases? So I think I've gone a bit off topic there, but I think it's quite an interesting time in the legal sector, the way that databases and data is going to help lawyers in their work. I'm not one of these people who think it's the end of lawyers. I think a lot of these tools are going to end up being very useful tools for lawyers. I tend to think, you know, if something's going wrong, if you have had a medical accident happen to you, or if you are a doctor who is being sued, I'm not sure that you really want a machine looking after you. I think you want to look someone in the eye and you want someone holding your hand through the process. So I think there's always going to be a place for lawyers myself. I just think the technology is really going to help them behind the scenes to get the right answer more often, and also to help them be very competitive on cost, because obviously they can, you know, it'd be a lot cheaper to use the machine learning thing than all those lawyers in the background.
And there's lots of, I think you're right, it'll shift the skills away from pure knowledge of the law to some of the interpersonal skills that may not always have been at the forefront of that. But I think there's some other examples from other fields, and I was thinking particularly healthcare, for instance, where one of the things, radiologists who used to be limited by how many x-rays they could read and give an opinion on in an afternoon without traveling from place to place to place, now are seeing 10 times as many x-rays because they can all be delivered electronically to their office. And the converse effect of that is, you know, if you've got a fractured left arm, you don't have to have it just seen by a radiologist. You can have it seen by the world's expert in fractured left arms, wherever they're located. So it becomes that really niche specialization as well. So instead of having to go to your local firm or your multinational firm and hope that they connect you with the person that knows something about this, they can actually electronically put that call out and have the leading expert weigh in on your case.
Absolutely, and also you can funnel these straightforward fractures one way, and you can make sure all the really complicated things get funneled somewhere else. So there's lots of fantastic opportunities.
Well, and I think that part of the role could actually be something that knowledge mobilization can have an impact on.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, hold on one second. Something just happened there.
Oh.
I think I accidentally clicked my mute all. Uh-oh.
Oh, hi, Shasta.
Right.
Can I call you back in about 3 minutes because I'm on a webinar right now? Thanks.
Sorry. He meant to mute himself. Okay. Sorry. We'll move on to the next question.
Sorry, did I not mute myself? I thought I had muted that before I answered the phone.
Yeah, and then but I thought you weren't done. I thought I accidentally clicked something. It was just my fault there.
Continue without me.
Okay, sorry. We'll go to Peter next, who's got a question here.
Hi, Helen. Great to hear more about sort of how knowledge sharing happens between lawyers. And I was particularly interested when you were talking about sort of deep and complex knowledge. And you mentioned that there's sometimes conflicting expert knowledge between lawyers, and they have to find a way of resolving it, these multiple inputs, and how to make sense of them. And I was sort of wondering, you talked about conversations, and they use sort of their conversations to resolve that. Can you maybe elaborate a bit more on how that works? How do they decide? Do they think one evidence trumps the other, or do they find a way of blending it effectively? So how do they deal with these conflicts in these conversations?
Well, in my field, in litigation, really it comes down to your own tacit knowledge, all the experiences that you have had. So when you're talking about procedural matters where there is discretion, it's those lawyers who have had lots of experience, whether that's, running these cases themselves, reading about these cases, or being part of a wider team involved in these cases, and then seeing generally what happens and trying to draw out strategies for handling them. But a lot of the time with a client, you are setting out, especially with a knowledgeable client like mine, I would deal with NHS practitioners who, know how to run these cases. I wasn't dealing with members of the public. A lot of the time you would be laying out the evidence and where you think things will go, but, giving them the idea of, where the preponderance of evidence lies. So an awful lot of it is to do with experience and knowledge, and, a fair amount of it is to do with knowledge that's, quite deeply held, that people don't always know that they've got, which is why I think conversation is so important, because, it's often through your contextual discussion that people can bring the knowledge to the forefront of their mind. Often people don't quite realise what they know until they start to have the conversation with each other, and then they're sort of, talking about, what happened when and different cases they've been involved in, and then that kind of brings forward the knowledge into the right place in their memory so that they can talk to each other about it. So I personally think there's something very special about conversation as opposed to other means of knowledge sharing that helps people in these complicated situations where you're relying very much on experience and tacit knowledge and that kind of thing. Does that help?
That's great. I mean, that's very insightful. That sort of helps with, and sort of the importance of tacit knowledge that sort of helps to contextualize that and gives sort of a steer of which way to move is sort of fascinating. And so it's documented as well. So once they decide on, given this context and given the knowledge that we have and the experience, we should move this way forward, will that then be sort of put into sort of a precedent or an expert database that people can rely back on, or does it remain in those conversations?
It often remains as conversations, but then I think the important thing to remember is that, two people have the conversation, that knowledge ends up embedded in both of those people, and then if you have strong networks, then people can talk to both of those people now about that issue. So if you connect people widely, then that knowledge will eventually get spread around in that way. So do you see what I'm trying to say?
It's the multiplier effect. That's great.
Yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just cognizant of the time. We have one more online chat question, and then I just want to close with a couple of remarks here. But there's a specific question. When you're talking to law firms, what specifically do you say to them to convince them about the value of knowledge sharing and profitability?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested to hear from you lot, actually, if you come across any really good, solid evidence of the value, the monetary value of knowledge sharing, knowledge management, because I've seen, a few papers, I've seen some people try and put a figure on it. I've seen some research in America that suggests that firms that announce a new knowledge management program or strategy, their share price improves. There's lots of little bits that I found that try to put a figure on it, but it is really, really difficult to do. Really difficult. I mean, what I tend to do with law firms is explain to them all the different ways that it improves their business, and then they kind of connect the dots for themselves on the monetary side of things when I tell them about how they can, with a really simple process improvement, perhaps they can become more competitive on a fixed fee for conveyancing of a home, say. That's a really competitive field of law certainly in the UK anyway, sort of buying and selling houses, you know, you kind of need a lawyer for that, because you really do want to own that home that's costing you hundreds of thousands, and you don't want it to fall into a mine shaft. You need the conveyancing done properly, but there's a lot of competition out there. So process improvements can really help that way, as can having decent precedents and having trusting networks, so that when a tricky thing comes up, the conveyancing lawyers know who to talk to and get that resolved really quickly. So yeah, it's a bit difficult to put a figure on it, but those are the kinds of things that I talk about.
We need an economist in here to do a cost benefit analysis and put a number to it. That'd be great. So just in closing, I just want to get a sense of, you know, what are you up to at the moment, what are your plans for the future, and if people are interested in you or the services that you offer, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, the easiest way to find out how to get in touch with me is to look at my website, which is theknowledgebusiness.co.uk. I am on Twitter. I'm on Twitter all the time. I love that a bit too much. I'm also experimenting with Pinterest at the moment. If anyone has any knowledge boards on Pinterest, I'm on there. I have a blog called Knowledge for Lawyers, where, I mean, if you're interested in knowledge managers in the legal sector, I've got a series running at the moment of Q&As with heads of knowledge. So trying to understand what types of people they are and how they're different to your average lawyer who stays a lawyer. So that's quite interesting as well. So that's how you can find out more about me. What I'm up to, well, I've just released dates for teaching, but I have to say that's all in London, really. So, although I'd love to teach somewhere else, but the travel can be a bit tricky, justifying the cost of that. But I'm just starting my first online courses next year. My first one is going to be all about measurement, because as you can imagine, from everything that I've said today, lawyers are really obsessed about measuring the success or otherwise of all their knowledge projects that they do. So I'm kind of testing it out January, February time, and then I'm hoping it's going to go live in March. So that's my exciting project for next year.
Yeah, that's really great. I know we had some questions about sort of the metrics and how do you evaluate this sort of thing. So I think doing that online course would be excellent for those people that are interested.
Yeah, well, if you're interested in metrics, can you?
Yep, that's
my article's in here, but there's all kinds of really, really great people in there. Mine is a really practical guide. You know, some people have written very lovely and intelligent articles about, you know, whether you can measure ROI and that kind of thing. Mine is just, if your business says you have to do it, this is how you can approximate a decent answer. So mine's a very practical guide.
That's excellent. That's something that I'd be definitely interested in reading as well.
Yeah,
so, I mean, I'm trying to get into it. But anyway, that was great. Thank you so much for the conversation. We've recorded the conversation. It takes a couple hours to process, so it'll be up on the KIPLN network website next week. We'll post it. But yeah, I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom. And, I know you were unsure whether you'd sort of fit into this network, but I mean, the issues that you face and everything you talked about, I think is relevant to all of us here. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh no, it's been an absolute pleasure. Really, really fantastic to see everyone and talk to everyone. I was a bit worried about whether the conversation would work or, whether it'd be a bit like a first date and you'd run out of conversation after half an hour or something. But no, it's been really good. Really good.
Thanks. I'm glad I was a good date.
Cheers.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.